One.
Hello again. Thank you very much for joining us in another Tuesday discussion of Ayn Rand's essays. Today's essay is The Static Vacuum of Our Age. So, James, could you recapitulate a bit of Rand's view of art before we plunge into the definitive version of the essay? Why do men need art?
That's exactly it. Ayn Rand really was the first, I think, philosopher to understand the psychological role and the psychoepistemological role, to be a little more specific, that art plays in human life. As conceptual beings, she understood that we live in a world of high abstractions, mentally speaking. And sometimes our high abstractions can take us so high away from the concrete reality of the world that it's sometimes hard to see our concretes, the abstractions living in our concretes. Concretes can be messy and complicated and take a lot of analysis to figure out. What art does is it stylizes, essentializes a concrete to invoke in us the abstract. Our highest metaphysical abstractions are being invoked. Is life worth living? Are we determined, or do we have free will? And that'll come up in this discussion. Big metaphysical questions like that, whether the artist knows it or not, are going to show up in his art if it's a great work of art, and the artist, whether they know it or not, is going to respond to it. And so what Ayn Rand believes is that art is a concretization of a metaphysical abstraction such that we can actually perceptually experience and emotionally experience the full abstract meaning of the concept in a concrete. And that's what art does.
Now, talking about the essay as such, one of the interesting things which I couldn't completely answer is who was Rand addressing to, and what is the main point that she's trying to make through this essay?
This is a very interesting essay in the Romantic Manifesto. It appears as one of the later chapters, but it is actually one of the very earliest essays that Ayn Rand ever published on the subject of aesthetics. It was published in the very first year that she had come out with her newsletter, in the very first year of its publication, the Objectivist newsletter in 1962. I think this and her introduction to the Victor Hugo novel are the oldest pieces of the Romantic Manifesto. And so in one sense, it's the most general of her aesthetic essays. She's approaching the whole field of literary analysis, a theory of literature, from the standpoint of Romanticism versus Naturalism. She's trying to distinguish in the broadest terms here, since it is an early essay of hers on aesthetics, she's trying to distinguish in the broadest terms the historical and philosophical bases for the two different literary schools that she's trying to discuss here. The Romantic school of literature versus the Naturalist school of literature, which is fundamentally what this is about. And the audience she's addressing is her own objectivists in the Objectivist newsletter, but it fits in perfectly with her broader theory of aesthetics, and so it was reprinted in the Romantic Manifesto, which I urge everybody to read.
Now, the first part of the essay, she talks about what is art, why do men need art, and we have covered those essays in the past. But I was wondering if we could jump a bit into the part where she talks a bit more about the roles of an aesthetician, and something related to that is the sense of life a standard of the judgment of an aesthetician.
Well, there are different ways that we can assess a work of art. I can philosophically disagree with the artist's theme. Yes, in literature, the theme is very conceptually explicit. And I can disagree quite vehemently with the artist's philosophy and still recognize his work as a highly skilled work of art. He's a great artist. If I disagree, say, with some ancient Greek tragedies, fatalistic, deterministic sense of life, or Shakespeare and Macbeth telling us life is, a poor player that struts and frets, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I could totally disagree with the philosophy of Macbeth, that Shakespeare's presenting in Macbeth and still think Macbeth is a brilliant play, masterfully done dramatically, for example, or the way he develops the play, or there are so many different ways in which you can analyze the skill depending on the nature of the art form. Here, literature, there's so many ways you can appreciate the poetry of the language all in itself, and that is a great virtue, say, of Shakespeare. So the aesthetician must be careful to distinguish between what we're talking about. What we respond to is not necessarily, you can have an emotional response simply from the great quality of the art. I can emotionally respond to Macbeth, even though I disagree with it. Part of my emotional response may be a negative one because I disagree with his philosophy, but part of it may be just what Shakespeare wanted me to feel, the pathos and power of it, because he's such a powerful artist. Sense of life tells you what you will find important in art. Because what a sense of life is, according to Ayn Rand, is sort of the subconscious or psychological manifestation of our deepest held metaphysical beliefs. And so if I am a determinist, or if I do believe in free will, that will have a profound effect on how I respond to certain works of art. If I'm a determinist and I see this fatal flaw in Macbeth, yeah, that's life, boy. That's all we can do. I'm stuck with that. So it confirms your sort of sense of life, and you have a stronger reaction to it. Whereas a work of art which, say, doesn't even have the same quality as, artistic quality, but shares your sense of life. Yeah, that shares my philosophy. That's something I can respond to. A hero, say in a action adventure film, a James Bond movie or something. I can respond more to that than I can, say, to this high art because I share its sense of life. But the sense of what I'm doing there is I'm having an emotional reaction based on the philosophy that we both implicitly share. And that's different than the quality of necessarily the art. On the other hand, it will have a huge impact on how I respond to art. If, as Ayn Rand says, if the standard in epistemology is what is true, if the standard in ethics is what is good, the standard in aesthetics is what is important. And what is important to you, Alejandro, will depend upon your metaphysical premises that you've inculcated into your own psychology, and that will determine your sense of life reaction to art.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering. For a while I lost you, but I think
I'm sorry.
It was a bit intermittent. I lost you for a while. Is there intermittence? No. Sorry.
Okay, I'm sorry. I hope you didn't miss anything important. No, we were just saying that there's a difference between sense of life. The sense of life is a manifestation of the artist's deepest held philosophical beliefs, and your response to it as a viewer of the art is a manifestation of your deepest held philosophical beliefs. It may or may not correspond to the quality of the work of art. I may respond to, a James Bond movie more emotionally intensely than I do, say, some high work of art because I share the philosophy. It's what's important to me. And I've just finished by saying that if, as Ayn Rand says, the standard in epistemology is truth, the standard in ethics is good, so the standard in aesthetics is what's important. And that'll depend on your philosophy as an artist or a viewer of art. And that is a separate issue, really, than the quality of the artistic skill.
Thank you very much, James. So I want to go to your field, which is history. Could you talk more about the historical pattern of art? What has been the consistent method, and what have been the exceptions that Rand talks about in the essay?
Well, the great exception, of course, was the 19th century. But you can go back further. If Renaissance artists such as Shakespeare, or of classical Greek tragedians such as Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles, the greatest, they basically have a fatalistic view of life. Now, the ancient Greeks had a magnificent sense of life in one sense. They had a man glorifying, they just glorified the human image in their art, and they had wonderfully logical, their architecture even tells you something about their order and their sense of aesthetics. But in the field of literature, philosophy was still in a very primitive state, and literature is very much dependent on philosophy. So they still had, although you could have magnificent ancient Greek literature, I'm talking the Odyssey, and I'm talking the plays of Sophocles like Antigone, some great literature, which is still ultimately fatalistic, which was still their view. Now, in the Renaissance, emerging from the Dark and Middle Ages, you began to see a change in focus in literature, say from Dante's Divine Comedy, which was sort of a religious metaphysics, spilled out or spun out in an epic, like Dante's Divine Comedy. This is the Christian metaphysics of the world, right? Paradise and the Inferno and Purgatory, and he goes on a tour of all that. That characterized medieval art. By the time you get to like the 1400s, humanism has now changed art, and we now have romantic stories about love. But Petrarch and Boccaccio, the great Italian poets, would tell love stories. Now they were tragic, they were doomed love stories almost always, right? And again, later on in the Renaissance, in the late 16th century and the early 17th century, Shakespeare was also being rather fatalistic, although he too was producing great art focused on earthly values. So there was a movement towards the secular and towards the earthly. But Ayn Rand is pointing out here that there was a revolution in art that occurred in the 19th century. In literature characterized by the emergence of the novel. And there can be no question that from the late 18th century to the end of the 19th century was the great age of the European novel. I mean, my gosh, a whole new art form, a whole new genre was generated in the West by great novelists, from the Bronte sisters and Jane Austen through Victor Hugo, through, in America, Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne. There's a whole new genre of art that came into being, the novel, telling the story of a person. And it reflected a whole new school of art, a whole new perspective on things, which introduced the idea that human beings actually made choices, had values, and that those choices and values made a difference to their life and had an impact. We could control our lives, at least to some degree. And so you've got great heroes like Jean Valjean in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, maybe the outstanding example of the romantic novel from the century. Here he is making choices. In the early scene in the book, he holds his life in his hands and he makes an ethical choice to become a different person. And that choice has consequences. And we see that choice and its consequences spilling out in the logical plot of this epic novel. And of course, because the choice is a moral one, we're given a stark contrast between the moral vision of Jean Valjean and his antipode Javert through the course of the story. And so it comes to a moral theme. Values are important. Values matter. Your choices are important. They matter. And can have an impact on your life. You can bring order to your life this way. So it's a way of looking at the world that assumes volition, free will. And that's basically the premise of it. But it had its great flowering, and no question about it, in the 19th century, when it was the dominant literary form of art. No question, the novel.
I don't know enough or anything at all about the history of art, but my impression is that in literature, before the novel, people didn't invent histories as such. They just made, Rand mentions the chronicles, but also with plays, people usually try to grab mythology or past stories and just
That's what it was. That's what
do
it
you
was.
think
Macbeth was a historical, semi-legendary historical king of Scotland. Or, the legends around, or Hamlet is just a retelling of the ancient Greek stories of Orestes, plays told by Aeschylus way back in ancient Greece. He has to kill his mother because mother killed his father because she, just like in Hamlet. Yeah, so they were retellings of ancient myths, generally speaking, or histories on purpose and retellings that way. So they were, in effect, chronicles. Sometimes outright fiction, outright sometimes fantasy, but those were held to be pretty much just allegories. But you're right, pretty much it was focused on a historical or at least a religious legend that they're recapitulating in some way.
So what that takes me to is that the whole idea of creating a story, and specifically with what the Romanticists were trying to do, led in turn into the novel, which was, as you said, the uh, perpetuation of the idea that the characters have free will, and she has a very particular notion of what that entails. Could you talk a bit more
Yes.
about that?
Yes. See, instead of just saying, recapitulating the way things happen to have been, this is just what happened, or this is my take on what was, the novel, by believing in free will and the potential of humanity, it can project possibilities that have not yet occurred. Instead of just telling us this is what did happen, it could tell us this is what should, could, can, might happen if we have the right values. And so instead of, as Ayn Rand used to love to quote Aristotle on this difference, and a very powerful quote from Aristotle: history only tells us, history is inferior to literature, according to Aristotle. Wow, interesting from an objective philosopher of logic to say that literature is more important than history. Because he said in literature, we only hear about the things as they are or have been. What literature can do, what art can do, is show us the way things should be and could be. It's a projection of our values. And that's really the difference. So fictional stories, I can tell you a story you've never heard before. In fact, an interesting story, more interesting than your life or my life, our rather ordinary lives. I can tell you the story of Jean Valjean or Cyrano de Bergerac, or, stepping it down one notch, the Count of Monte Cristo. Extraordinary events, which never going to happen to you and me probably, but they can happen. They could have happened. They're realistic enough to have happened, but they're telling us the stories of extraordinary characters and extraordinary events because they're exploring the human potential, not just human history.
And when you I heard the version, and then afterwards there's a Q&A version, I think probably with Alan Goldfeld, and one of the things that he asks is the why, for instance, the Homeric heroes are great, but she doesn't think that they have free will as such in the novels. And she thinks that because a very particular reason, and that is that they don't take their actions, they don't take the plot forward. It is the gods that are the ones who are taking the plot forward.
That's it. Boy, what a great answer she gave there. Is exactly, I hadn't reviewed that Q&A. Alan Gotthelf did wonderful sessions of Q&As with Ayn Rand on these things in the early 60s. In any event, I hadn't heard that one in a while, but I would have given the exact same answer. If you read the Iliad or you read the Odyssey, the great hero of the Iliad, Achilles, his anger does move things. It's his anger that moves things, but at every step of the way, there's a goddess, Athena, or a goddess, his mother Thetis, or there's a god over here fighting him, and it's the gods that motivate. Achilles will throw a spear, but it's Apollo that'll make sure that the spear misses Paris, or Athena that'll make sure that the spear hits Paris, or so whatever. Right? With Odysseus, it's the same way. Odysseus is brilliant. He's brilliant. Odysseus is one of the descriptions Homer is constantly giving him in the Odyssey. And we see him being clever, and his cleverness does matter. But who's always whispering in his ear? Who's always inspiring him? There's Athena or Hermes. They'll come along, they'll tell him what to do, they'll inspire him, they'll fill him with an emotion, and that emotion will drive him. So at every critical stage in even in Homer's epics, even though his characters like Achilles and Odysseus have character traits like pride and wrath on the part of Achilles, or cleverness and cunning on the part of Odysseus, those features sort of fade into the background because the goddess Athena is the one who's really in control. She's the one directing the weapons, motivating them, inspiring them, giving them emotions. Yes.
So, with that said, what do you think about naturalism, which basically took the same work, which is a novel, and just tried to make something different? Could you tell us a bit more what Rand thinks about them and what is their crucial contradiction?
Well, she notes in this article that towards the end of the 19th century, Romanticism was already starting to fade dramatically because of the notion of determinism, a fatalistic notion, also a notion that thought, oh, well, the Count of Monte Cristo and Jean Valjean and Cyrano de Bergerac, oh, that's not realistic. Like Cyrano, you can't compose brilliant poetry as you're fencing in a brilliant way as the best swordsman in France. That's not realistic. Come on, Jean Valjean, come on, that's not realistic. Or the Count of Monte Cristo, oh, come on, that's not the folks next door. And so this idea was, that's not realistic. We have to present things as they are, not as they should be. A slice of life. Be realistic. Don't don't have your head in your clouds, in the clouds about these wild dreams that really can't happen to ordinary people. So we have to, first the thought was, let's go to a statistical average. Let's just present people as they are. But very quickly that deteriorated into showing us the other end of the margin, not the extraordinarily wonderful and exciting people in stories, but at the other end, the depressing, awful, most pitiful, most pathetic stories and examples that you can find. So suddenly we went from heroes, extraordinary heroes, to the sewer, in effect. And if you're not a axe murderer or a drug addict, then you're being unrealistic. You see, it's not the way things are. The era of the novel continued, and the great American era of the novel continued until the middle part of the 20th century, with many of our great novelists. But now you can see the novels taking a dim naturalistic turn. Some of the best American novelists of the 20th century, men like John Steinbeck, who Ayn Rand even thought was a good writer, and they're talking the grimmest parts of life, or even get worse. It gets much with the plays of, say, Tennessee Williams, where you're now focused on people with psychological problems, people who are particularly pathetic, people at that other down end of the spectrum, as if that was more realistic. But that's unfortunately the state of literature as Ayn Rand found it in the middle of the 20th century, falling down, in effect, into a sense of life sewer in the name of naturalism.
Wasn't the original idea of naturalism to say, well, this is the average, this is what people encounter in real life? And at the end, what you were seeing in the movement was something that you didn't observe at all.
Well,
why?
It begins by saying, well, a lot of it, I think, is politically motivated here. Sure, some of our positivistic friends, were saying that science implies determinism, but I really don't think that was the main thrust in literature. I think it was the social activism. It was the rise of socialism. And so their focus now turns from, even the ordinary to the miserable, to the poor, and there was a little bit of that, all throughout Romanticism too, a sense of it with its Christianity. I mean, Hugo was a Christian socialist. The book was called Les Miserables, right? So there's a sense of that even in Romanticism. But by the end of the 19th century, that now completely takes hold. It's as if all those wonderful stylized portraits in Hugo and Dickens are now merely valuable because they're serving our social political statement end. And that's why the left preserved those guys. And by the time the 20th century turns around, now what we have to do is we write about all these horrible stories about how men are just cogs in this capitalistic machine, or how the poor are being oppressed in slums, etc., etc. And in America, boy, socially progressive novelists began to really focus on just that, the poor, and we're all caught in a machine, and it's a jungle. It's the economic forces are an octopus, and I'm not making up those those metaphors.
So, related to this idea of the social crusaders, Rand says that that was something that despite that they were the social crusaders, they didn't believe in free will.
Isn't that a bit of a paradox?
And it kind of looked like a paradox, but don't you think that it's rather a feature, that it coincides with their theory, in the sense that well, man is helpless, so we should have a welfare state, rather than, well, we should fight for this, and then we should have, and then, well, okay, I cannot make up with the idea of free will, so art is this, and the other one is another one of
Well, look at
compartmentalization.
Marx. Look at so many of the leftist philosophical movements. Start with Marx. He's both a determinist and a radical activist. He's a revolutionary. Take to the barricades for the dictatorship of the proletariat. We're going to bring down the bourgeoisie. On the one hand, he's telling you to go out and be active, inspiring you, trying to inspire you to be a revolutionary. And on the other hand, saying, well, of course, it's all determined. It'll all work out. Nothing we really can do controls anything, and whatever you do, the inexorable path of history is towards this dictatorship of the proletariat, and of course, perfectly logical. A dictatorship will be the first step in the withering away of the state, and other logical statements like that. But that's all inevitable. His view of history is a deterministic one, and yet he paradoxically calls for people losing their chains, and right in the beginning of his manifesto. So yeah, it's a bizarre paradox. It's a contradiction. Determinism is a contradiction, though. Any theory of determinism is, of course, going to fly in the face of the fact that people do think, make choices, and so forth. So, yeah, it's a contradiction inherent in most social activism of the last century and a half.
So I want to return later about the current state of literature, but after she discusses naturalism, she also brings up one conversation in the Fountainhead between Tuhi and Ike, which is a worthless playwright, and he says, well, there's no space for you in Ibsen. It's either you or Ibsen. Could you comment a bit more on that?
I have only read the work of Henrik Ibsen in translation. He's a brilliant playwright, and many of his plays are actually have profound themes that many objectivists, not all of them, but many of his plays have profound themes that objectivists would agree with, chime with. I'm emotionally moved by many of the great plays of Ibsen. In the canon of Western playwrights, Ibsen is ranked up there, maybe second only to Shakespeare in Western playwrights since ancient Greece. He's that good a playwright. Ibsen was a master. Ayn Rand, even in The Fountainhead, has a favorable, as you point out, a favorable reference to Ibsen. She liked Ibsen, at least some of his work. But wait a minute here, great art like Ibsen compared to Ike's? Yeah, I mean, come on. Or Howard Rourke's architecture versus Peter Keating's? Yeah. No, you can't. Greatness in itself, exceptional greatness, is exactly what Ellsworth Toohey was out after to destroy. That's why he was out to destroy Howard Rourke. And as he says to Peter Keating, there's two ways you can do that. You can, right? And the most insidious way is not just to put down Howard Rourke in greatness. No, 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 no. The most insidious way is to praise mediocrity, is to tell you Ike is a great playwright, that Ike is just as good as Ibsen, that there's no difference between Ike and Ibsen, to tell you there's no difference between Keating and Rourke. Really, its greatness is in the eyes of the unwashed masses, right? And how Ellsworth Toohey will lead them to this sense of security rather than a sense of greatness and inspiration. So, yeah, it is a profound connection here that you're making. Art loses its standards altogether, and greatness in art itself becomes less attainable when you're not romantic. When romantic art actually calls for values, quality, creativity, originality, in a way that ordinary junk doesn't. Naturalism doesn't necessarily. Naturalism can be junk and get away with it, and then your artist can say, well, that was you. The critics can say, well, that was just an ordinary thing, or that was just a freak show, and the artist can come right back and say, yeah, that's what I meant to do. Glad you got my theme.
It's, I mean, what about? I mean, we're talking now about the role of the aesthetic valuer, or the cultural state of praising art, and what do you think about this notion that, and I think it's still present in the Oscars and whatever. Could you comment on more on how on this view of praising a work of art because everyone hates them instead of when everyone loves it?
Well, one of the reasons why the 19th century saw the rise of romantic art is because it came with the age of capitalism, right? Before capitalism, artists were dependent on wealthy patrons, lords or cardinals of the church or something, the pope or something. They'd need some wealthy patron to back their art. And so most artists were backed by some wealthy patron, some lord or some church official, high church official that could sponsor their art. Capitalism liberated the artist. You begin to see artists like Beethoven. No, see, contrast Mozart and Beethoven is a great example. Mozart was dependent upon the Bishop of Salzburg or the Emperor in Vienna to fund his work. Beethoven made a living by selling his music. Capitalism created for the artist a whole new commercial opportunity. But of course, that makes art dependent on popular reaction. That makes art actually, the artist actually have to sell it like a product and get people to like it. So only popular artists were successful. Well, no. 20th century artists, we can't have success, be it, because that would probably stick us back with romanticism, or at least some kind of bootleg romanticism with heroes and villains and themes and, plots that make sense, stories that are interesting, things like that. No, we can't have that. And so capitalism is sort of the enemy for this anti-art. They want to shove down the public in the 20th century, whether it was the visual arts like modern art and fancy art museums, or whether it was this literature, this sort of really depressing literature that started coming out, the plays of Tennessee Williams that I just mentioned. Who for fun would go see Streetcar Named Desire? It's not fun. It's not inspirational. People do, the critics loved it. The critics praised it. It got all kinds of critics. And if the people don't like it, well, that's so much shows you how lowbrow and stupid the unwashed masses are. Is that what you were getting at?
Well, I mean, in the past, people were more in the idea of the masses are always right. Let's give democracy. Now it's more
exactly. A million Frenchmen can't be wrong.
Right. Exactly. And why didn't they praise Star Wars or whatever other films?
I lived as a young man through the 1970s, which was a very interesting time. In the 1960s and 1970s, films had gotten so depressing, such downers. And it's gritty slice of life, stories of really horrible, tragedies that were just focused on the tragedy in itself, or some serial killer. They did Truman Capote's naturalistic novel In Cold Blood about serial killers and tried to, make you feel sympathetic for these serial killers. It reached such a low point by the late 60s and 1970s, that there was a revolution, a reaction of bootleg, not real romanticism, but bootleg romanticism. Like you point out, Star Wars. I mean, it may have been childish, may have been juvenile, may have had some poor storytelling, and all that's true. But at least there were heroes and villains. There were clear black and white in the ethical issue. People responded to it. It was the most popular film that they'd had in 50 years, right? So the point is that people are starved for values. People are starved for heroes. That's what people actually find to be psychological fuel, the inspiration they need to go get on with their life. That's what's fun to watch. No, but for all those reasons, Star Wars and this sort of bootleg romanticism, the Indiana Jones films and the more popular films that started coming out in the mid-70s through the 80s were really, and now you've got sort of it being replaced with the action-adventure film, which replaces the plot really with a chase scene. So you got an exciting car chase scene, breathtaking or space chase scene, breathtaking chase in outer space, which replaces any real story, which of course replaces any real theme. So it's not as though it's true romantic art, but at least it's giving people what people actually need art for. that concretization of their metaphysical values so they can emotionally experience them. I want to see heroes, and I want to see people making tough decisions, and I want to see them prevail. That is a psychological need people have. And that psychological need was utterly being ignored for philosophical reasons by the aesthetic elites of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. And it's given us this false alternative, this sort of, okay, it's cheap, commercial, popular, but it's just a lowbrow thriller over here versus high art, which is going to be depressing, may not even make sense to you. You're going to have 6 essays to tell you what it really means. Yeah.
So returning to the role of the aesthetician, last week we talked about axiomatic concepts. And one of the things that Rand said in the essay is that modern philosophers, or at least what she was seeing modern in her time, is that they rejected axioms because it allowed them to pretend to live in a world where anything they wished was possible. Could you integrate that notion to these lectures, aestheticians, modern aestheticians?
It connects intimately with the concept we've referred to now repeatedly, sense of life. And whether the artist means it, knows he's expressing a sense of life, wants to express a life, even knows that's what's going on in anyone else's head, he is expressing a sense of life, and he is expressing a philosophy. An artist can't help but express a philosophy. If you accept an objective reality, which is in fact what the axioms are telling us, if you accept that reason can know the world, if you accept that another axiom, that people have free will and can control their mind and therefore have some control over their life, and they can achieve their long-range values under most circumstances in a free society. If you have a benevolent universe principle, if that approach to certainty and human nature informs your metaphysics, it will result in a certain sense of life. On the other hand, if you think, no, knowledge is not possible, the world is not knowable, it's chaos, that too will be reflected in your art. That will come through. That will be expressed. In a Tolstoy novel, a great novel, mind you, Anna Karenina, she's helpless. She's a helpless pawn to fate. No matter how tragic her fate and how much we sympathize with her, there's just really nothing she can do, and that's just life. And that's just life. And Tolstoy is like, well, yeah, that's just life. Horrible tragedy, but there you are. That's what reality is. Reality is the tragedy of Anna Karenina, and if you happen to be in her situation, you'll just end up throwing yourself in front of a train. That's what he's saying.
So what do you think has changed? Do you think it's improved in some senses? Do you think that there are some better elements today, or is it worse?
I see so much just as bad or worse, frankly. But on the other hand, I also see some things that are distinctly better than the end of the 20th century. For one thing, I see novelists that I know writing novels and having some success, Don Watkins or Warren Fay or something. I see people who are friends of mine who are actually successful novelists, and that's a good sign. I see certain films responding in a more serious way to serious values. But they too tend to be the exceptions, but they are there. And it's not just, in those limited ways either. I see some things at least getting a little better at the margins, but mostly things are heading in the same direction. Do we still have time to turn it around? Yeah. And people do respond to beauty, heroes, inspiration, believe it or not. And so, again, I think we have reality and human psychology on our side. At the end of the day, people will, I think, respond more positively to real values and to the reality that their life, that they can bring some meaning and have some control over their lives and bring values to them. I think that is a message that will inspire And that's the message people psychologically need from their literature. So at the end of the day, we have reality on our side as usual, but the journalistic reality around us is still pretty bad.
I have one last question for you, but let me first read the super chats. Thank you to Robert, who is quoting Ayn Rand, saying art is an indispensable medium for the communication of a moral ideal.
Profoundly true. You'll
Uh,
notice that most religions tell stories. They'll tell it by means of an allegory, a fable, the life story of a hero, the life of Jesus in the Gospels, say, or the life of the saints and the martyrs in Christian thought. They need those stories. And by means of telling a story, I can communicate so much more powerfully, so much more concretely, and so much more effectively what it is to see. You see, when I'm done reading The Fountainhead, I can confront a situation that Howard Rourke never confronted, but I can still ask myself, what would Howard Rourke do? And his character is so strong in my mind that even though Howard Rourke never confronted this situation, instantly I know what Howard Rourke would do. It projects a moral ideal like nothing else can, a story. And that is why a nonfiction treatise on ethics is going to be infinitely less powerful than, say, The Fountainhead.
The second super chat is from Metija. Sorry if I butcher your name. Says, I wish I had a cool surname such as Valliant.
I was not, when I first met Nathaniel Brandon of all people, he immediately just, that's your real name, because he changed his name. But no, that's my real name. My father's is my grandfather's before him. It goes back hundreds of years. Yeah.
That's pretty
So
good.
I can't claim any creativity there, any credit for the name. It just happened to be born to me.
So,
But it is cool.
do you think that there is something? I have still my question, but do you think that there is something that we should have covered before I ask that?
No, I think we've done a really good job here. It is a brief essay, and as I say, it's one of Ayn Rand's earliest essays. So it's a good place to start, even though it's deep in the Romantic Manifesto. You might want to start with this essay. Go all the way back to this essay because it's a good introduction to her whole theory of literature, which is what the Romantic Manifesto basically is, and a wider theory of art as well. But it basically it's her first stab at distinguishing naturalism and romanticism in literature, and therefore lays out a lot of the her basic approach. One of her very first essays ever on aesthetics or literature. It really is. And so it lays out the basic differences in her mind between romantic literature and naturalistic literature, and sets the agenda, in effect, for the rest of her essays on aesthetics.
Thank you. So my last question is, what should one do? How to create a world that starts filling the aesthetic vacuum of our age?
Well, I am not an artist, but I am a great appreciator of the work of artists. I love art, and I love the visual arts. I love music. I love literature, and very, very much. And all I can do is beg and plead those who have a vision out there not to give up. Culture that is bankrupt, in a culture that will fight you, in a culture that will be bigoted against maybe your politics, certainly be bigoted against a view, say, of the heroic in human nature, bigoted certainly against a view of projecting values, because that's going to be unrealistic, because you're going to present some hero who's going to do some extraordinary thing. How dare you? Please don't be dissuaded by this awful culture. Please don't be dissuaded by the critics. Please don't be dissuaded by the teachers who are going to beat you down. I know, as I say, I know artists. I know visual artists. I know music makers. I know novelists. And they have to fight a culture to get real values out there. And they are heroic in my mind. To make a culture that makes it easier for them is the job of a philosopher. And so what we can do is we can promote and advocate a rational philosophy that can correct a culture that can make life for artists who are there exploring values and trying to inspire us a lot easier. But at the end of the day, it's the artist who gives us these things. And it's artists like Ayn Rand. It's great artists who I just want to, and it's kind of an emotional plea here. I know right now our culture is hell. And if you're an artist of values, you're going through hell. It's part and parcel of it. It adds to your heroism in bringing us your beauty and your values and your inspiration. So don't give up, artists. People like me really, really need it. It matters to us. You inspire us. You lift us up. You make me laugh and cry and fall in love. And don't stop doing that, because it's essential to my life. It's essential to all of our lives. And you guys, as artists, are doing an important thing, especially if you're trying to project heroes' values in this world, this bleak aesthetic world. So I want to say thank you to the artists, and don't give up.
And thank you, James, for these words. So I think that concludes our discussion. Thank you very much, James.
Well, thank you, Alejandro. Another good one. Thank you. Please do consider becoming a subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK. We have an exciting year being planned. Rosie is planning the most exciting year, and all kinds of material is coming out. And for a mere £10 a month or more, don't forget the or more, you can participate and get all of the services that Ayn Rand Center UK provides. So please hit like, hit subscribe, share, comment, and if you can, become a permanent paying subscriber to Ayn Rand Center UK. We're creating an international community of people interested in these ideas and these values. And I think that's really what one can do. So thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.